That's your first slide, right? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, are we good to go? Are we good to go? Everyone can hear. Well, I can see you and you can hear me here. I hope everyone can hear at home or wherever you are. So, as John said, I am Secretary of the Anthropocene Working Group, but only since 2019, rather than when it was conceived in 2009. So I'm going to start. It's a very quick story, I hope, running up to where we are now with the work of the Anthropocene Working Group. I'm going to start in around 2000. When Paul Crutzen, the atmospheric chemist and as you all know, Nobel Prize winner, he was working and his colleagues in the IGBP, the IPCC climate change biodiversity group in the late 90s, and they were getting to a point where they were realizing that the Earth systems as we know them were not really. It's very hard to say that we're operating in a Holocene in conditions. So he came out of this Eureka-style moment in a conference in Mexico when he said, we should stop calling it Holocene. We really should call it, and this is where he said we should call it the Anthropocene. Threw that word in there, and everyone went, "Oh, that's actually a pretty good idea to describe this period of time." Like these graphs you can see here, with things like greenhouse gases. I'm moving, even though the camera's not on me. The greenhouse gases there at the bottom from the Pleistocene and Holocene, where they're relatively stable, and then as a result of fossil fuel combustion and land use changes in a very recent period of time has dramatically changed the Earth system as we know. And this is why he said, well, we are clearly not in the Holocene, we are now in this Anthropocene. So these ideas then got developed in the 2000s by people like Will Stephan, who then looking at, trying to think about when this occurred, then then they started looking at, well, but are we looking at when it first started or when the most significant change occurred? And then this led to the development of the idea of a great acceleration, this idea of the mid-20th century when industrialization really kicked off. So not the low-level stuff, the stuff we're all used to in the Holocene, but this massive amount of fossil fuel combustion and everything contained with that developed. And so these ideas were developed and sort of ran with it. And there were lots of ideas about, think about the origins and is this really right? And, like these classic academic debate. So in around 2007, 2008, then the London Geological Society said, well, should we start thinking of this actually as a real geological unit? And as a result of that, the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy, which is a group of one of these international groups of geology, they actually created the Anthropocene Working Group and said, look, if we're thinking of calling it a unit and we'd like to explore it further, you actually need a task group to do it. So about 2009, the AWG was developed, and that's continued ever since. So in 2019, as a result of more deliberations, then there was like a vote that occurred in Cape Town within the AWG, and it was like, well, shall we go for this? Shall it be a geological unit? And the answer unanimously was yes. And then it was, well, shall we, and at what scale of this change? Is it actually a new unit on the scale of an epoch? And again, there was a majority vote of yes. So there we go, there's a remit. So we're looking for a new geological unit that's different from the Holocene and it's of an epoch scale. So so then what rather usefully happened was there was some support from a group in a minute I'll just go through, but to do this, you actually need to go and get geological evidence. So to provide evidence of a golden spike, you do actually need to go and do some geology and define these stratigraphic units and say, this is where you can see this significant change that occurred that has taken us out of the Holocene. And so between 2019, when I joined the AWG, up to the end of last year, in 2023, we've been looking for these golden spikes, these golden stratotype sections and points, which are a way that geologists and stratigraphers use to define changing periods, these units of time that you see in the geological timescale. So around 2012, 2022, we were very lucky, the AWG, to end up in a collaborative relationship with HKW, the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin, and also the Max Planck Institute for History of Science. And they provided funding for us as part of this big collaborative project to work through and actually explore what it means by defining a new epoch and looking at these, these social, scientific and cultural complexities of the geological Anthropocene. So we've been very busy. 11th July 2023 was an interesting date. That was the conclusion of about, 2 years of doing the research to actually create and produce this geological evidence. And then there was 7 months of voting, which then culminated with, we were able to announce a meeting with our Max Planck colleagues. And we actually said, well, this is the site we've chosen to hold this golden spike site. And it's based on the markers that we use to detect human activity, various markers, lots of markers you can find in sediment cores. The principal one in Crawford Lake was plutonium from the nuclear weapons testing in the mid-20th century. This big increase, that spiky thing at the bottom there, this here, the audience members here, this is a concentration of carbonaceous particles which are emitted from fossil fuel power stations. So that is a huge acceleration. This great acceleration of combustion of fossil fuels is writ large in all these stratigraphic sections. So then July 2023, having chosen a site, and it is a beautiful, if any of you are here are geologists, this is chef's kiss stratigraphy to get involved with. So irrespective of whether or not this is, this continues, this is wonderful stuff to work with, because it really does combine history and geology. Those are annual, sub-annual layers where you can detect years as if going through a calendar. These are amazing things to investigate. So following on from 2023, as a result of actually choosing a site, then we had to actually put together a proposal, and this was the proposal that we submitted on the 31st of October 2023. And in that proposal, it's a big series of documents, a couple of 100 pages of executive summaries, stratigraphic evidence, looking at all the 12 sites we investigated. And we came up with the proposed site, this is Crawford Lake, with the proposed GSSP, and we also came up with evidence as required by the protocols required for a GSSP of these 3 standard auxiliary boundary stratotypes. And I will just point out here, people in the audience here, what the red dots here is plutonium signal we see in these 3 sites scattered across from Canada to Japan to China to Poland. It's a very distinct signal of plutonium that we see. And this is, we've known for a long time that plutonium has left an indelible mark around the mid-20th century. And it's isochronous. This is a very distinct horizon. And that's why it's so useful to use if you're trying to determine where the mid-20th century is. So we did it on Halloween, just before midnight, which was auspicious, I was at the time. And then we submitted it to the SQS, and the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy is our group of others. And I've done it as a black square there because that's where the mystery happened. Because a lot of stuff has occurred in there, and we know, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's interesting about this is having submitted so much information, we still have not had yet any formal response about the quality of the proposal. We've had a series of long-running opinions being told to us. We've had lots of things that said, all this sort of stuff. But what we haven't had is actually we haven't had our essay marked. On the 5th of March 2024, in the New York Times, it was released, Are We in the Anthropocene? Human Age, Note Scientists Say. And for a lot of members in the Anthropocene Working Group, this was the first time we heard of our result, which is an astonishing thing to do, even though you would imagine the ziggurat of stratigraphy is an enormously bureaucratic system. It kind of isn't. So there was a lot of media stuff that came out, and this was the result. The result was the SQS turned us down. And so 5th of March, by the 21st of March, the whole of the International Commission of Stratigraphy, the voting people in the units above us from the International Commission of Stratigraphy and the International Union of Geological Sciences had all then supported the findings from the SQS and told us that the Anthropocene as an epoch is not a thing. And I just finished just now, just thinking in terms of future. So the Anthropocene Working Group, as a unit developed from the SQS, once our proposal was handed in and the vote has happened, we are now dissolved. We've actually recombined secretly, and we are still the Anthropocene Working Group, but working now independently from a stratigraphic commission. And just in terms of future, one of the things is now I'd just like to emphasize that even though now it's going to be very difficult now to actually try and get a resubmission in to say, well, we'll try again. We think it is an epoch. It's very hard to find people now who don't agree that an epoch level scale change has occurred. And so we are looking in a historical time frame of the Earth having gone through an astonishing change. And I've just put on the right-hand side there are just some of those predictions. Along the top there are all the previous epochs running from the Paleocene. So those are all existing epochs. And this is from a paper from 2020. And quite correctly, before all this work happened, they identified the Anthropocene occurring in 1950 as a result of this very marked uptick in CO2 emissions and global atmospheric temperature change. And then they've also plotted these future emission scenarios showing how we predict various air temperatures and marine carbon dioxide levels will occur in the next 300 years. And I know there's probably historians here, 300 years is not a long time. So we are looking, even though we might disagree right now about what we're going to call this, we have created a geological scale change that will affect the future history for many centuries to come. Okay.
Super. Thank you. So, Mark, yeah. Can we tell whether people online can pick up sound from, or how close we need to be to the mic? Because I saw this. It's better over there. Mark,
Do you mind coming up here?
Okay.
Yeah, I just thought I'd better clarify some of the things that Simon said, because unfortunately Simon's been deeply political, which, that's what politics is about. Oh no, science. Okay. So the first thing is you said about submitting the essay, not getting feedback. You didn't answer the question set. Okay, so it's the wrong essay. So for the last 10 years, the Anthropocene Working Group have decided that this is the great acceleration, and this is where humanity basically, it all went wrong. Okay, despite large numbers of papers being published going, well, actually archaeology, and if Dorian was here, he would say, look, impacts much further back in different places. So that's the first thing. The second thing is he's put that black box up. No, it is a standing committee. You know exactly who's there, and they made a very clear decision. It is not an epoch, okay? It could be even bigger than an epoch. And he said, oh, what will we call it? Well, for about the last 5 or 6 years, most geologists have used the word Anthropocene event. Events can be bigger than an epoch. Imagine the oxygenation event when basically oxygen was pumped into the atmosphere for the first time over 1 billion years and completely changed life on Earth. So events can be huge. They can be quite small as well. So it gives you a way of actually acknowledging the Anthropocene. We are in the Anthropocene, and this is where we have got very frustrated. Not Simon, but other members of the Anthropocene Working Group have fed into the media going, scientists say we're not in the Anthropocene, which is a lie. We're not in the Anthropocene epoch because geologists don't feel it's worthy of defining, because it actually then excludes other aspects. It excludes the social sciences. It excludes archaeology. It excludes all the others. So therefore, guess what? We're in the Anthropocene event. Does it matter when it started? Well, it could be when we evolved in Africa. It could have been when we started agriculture. It could have been when we did colonialization and started to rape the planet. Or it might be post-Second World War and the American Empire. But it is all of those things and more. So hence, just a few clarifications on Simon's political take on it. I'll leave you with that.
Next. Do you want to just respond very briefly to any of that, or comment on the epoch events history, or
I mean, it's the duality of this epoch event scenario has been played out for a long time, and there are merits in both. I think the concept of the event is different. It's a different concept to the concept that we're describing as an epoch. I think they are. There's a duality of them. you can talk about them, but they are separate. The scale of the epoch and the idea of like geologists not being able to recognize an epoch scale, I think is a really interesting thing, because this is the first time that a single species has been able to identify itself creating a geological change. That's quite an interesting thing. And certainly it's probably the first time a single species, some of the species more so than others for sure, have created an epochal scale change, whether it started a while ago or started in the 20th century. This is a huge change that humanity has created. And so I can see why people might consider it an event, but I think geologically and scale-wise, I think an epoch is the best fit. And that's not political. It's really interesting because, oh, it's a political thing. You go, oh my God, I've never done politics. And again, this sort of connecting politics and science is a really interesting thing, because we have been accused all the time of being political. This is some sort of political message we're trying to do. I've never met a bunch of less political people, but it has political connotations, and therefore you get stuck with political labels as well. So it's interesting. Thank you, Mark.
Super. Jenny will have lots to say, I think, now, just in response to that. I mean, even just in what Simon already said, it's fascinating to see the conjunction of basically the little history we've just given us, which is going back in months. The contrast between that very finely grained history with a very different finely grained history of the, of the corporate, like sedimentary material is. And just draw everyone's attention to that contrast of scales. But Jenny, do you want to make your introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it possible to move on the lights and turn them with people mind? I just think my slides are more visible.
Yes.
Sorry to be a pain. Sorry, before I just eject this.
Which one is yours?
Bulstrode.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, lovely. Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to be kind of responding, I guess, to that idea of scale, and I think it's relevant to events as well as epochs, I hope. Okay, so terminology matters in science because terms have the properties of instruments or models. They embody certain procedures and proxies for the phenomena under observation, and in doing so define the axes of experimentation. In the words of Gaston Bachelard, they are reified theorems, and that reification is achieved through community endeavor that reflects community interests. Take the process of calibration that's so fundamental to scientific activity. You have an alcohol thermometer, but how do you know if it is working? You could check it against another kind of thermometer, for example, a thermocouple, and see if the results you get are sufficiently similar, but that relies on some crucial steps. First, the relevant community must agree that they have confidence in the thermocouple. Second, they must agree what counts as sufficiently similar result. And third, they must agree to ignore that a thermocouple does not behave in the same way as an alcohol thermometer, but nonetheless to go on as if it does. Through this political process, important resolution and context are lost, but something powerful is gained. It becomes possible to connect with other theories, to move beyond existing experimental limits, develop new knowledge, and make overarching claims. Like instruments or models, terminology matters in science because a single word or a single thermometer is that vast accumulation of political processes in concentrated form that makes the articulation of phenomena possible. To paraphrase Stuart Hall, articulation in the sense of making connections and in the sense of expression. So when leading figures of the Anthropocene Working Group describe the need to define the Anthropocene in a form that best expresses quantified rate and the magnitude of change, they are doing what scientists are expected to do, They are articulating the term Anthropocene and making it into an effective instrument, a stable, calibrated form that can be connected with other theoretical constructs and conveys the enormity of the system change in quantified terms. They are doing what scientists have been expected to do for over 2 centuries, and that is the problem. Normally, at this point, I try to give some examples of the way in which dominant politics have shaped modern science. Perhaps the way in which John Tyndall first demonstrated what we now call the greenhouse gas effect in 1859, taking the apparatus of the then government's research program to establish coal as a universal fuel and using it to model the Earth's atmosphere. What we now call the greenhouse gas effect, he called a wondrous factory. So while Britain's colonies were forced to buy British coal and formerly enslaved people forced to labor unfree to load it, British scientists declared this manufactured inequality to be the natural order of things. Or perhaps how political economy provided Tyndall and his successors with their most powerful form of articulation, that claimed to bring all things into exchange through measurement. From the steelyard to Tyndall's radiant heat apparatus and Thomson's mass spectrometer, these were all instruments for transforming sample qualities into quantitative measures. These were all forms of scale, powerful not just because of their access to nature, but because they articulated with a dominant way of thinking that would weigh the world to reveal its value as if nature spoke for itself in the language of the market. Or perhaps a reminder that it is never nature speaking, and that science that goes against this dominant politics is always a political struggle. From as early as 1831, miners and scientists were well aware of how coal dust scarred human lungs. But it took over 100 years for miners' lung to be recognized by scientific consensus. And the victory was only achieved in 1943 through the active efforts of Welsh miners, their collective organization and their instrumental use of expertise, not anything self-evident or explicit in the coal dust that scarred them. They spoke for themselves because nature does not, and the dominant politics of the day would not. Normally, at this point, I'd like to give examples like these, but doing that only seems to reinforce an imagined divide, so that scientists either have a sense they're being told off, but are not sure why or with what, or worse, I'm just showing pretty pictures to provide background color to the achievements of hard science. I need to try a different articulation. Scientists often have a normative ideal of good science as being apolitical. The calibration of instruments and terms shows one of the ways in which that normative ideal of good science done well is political all the way down. Reification achieved through community endeavor that reflects community interests. Reflecting the interests of 19th century political economy, the instruments and models of later 19th century science worked on the fundamental premise that measurement would reveal a single unifying law by making disparate phenomena legible and bringing them into exchange. Like instruments and models, terms define the axes of experimentation. They establish the parameters of an experimental space. The idea that measurement makes phenomena legible and brings everything into exchange became the idea that if it's real, it can be measured, and that in turn became the idea that only that which can be measured is real. The dominant political economy was presented as the natural order of things, and extreme inequality and extraction as a natural tendency, requiring enlightened governors. Science that had once told its publics to see coal as a universal fuel, the Earth's atmosphere as like a coal-fired factory, and the brutal inequalities of coal's political economy a natural inevitability, now told them they could hear nature speak in a language of dollar signs from a script held in the dead hand of colonialism. The experimental space scientists defined became the mandate for the old colonial world order, to dress in new suits and rebrand under the name neoliberal economics, a system of extraction first established under Europeans, transatlantic human trade, and colonialism. If the term Anthropocene is the experimental space, what does it mean to define it by the great acceleration post-1952? We've seen how reification is achieved through community endeavor that reflects community interests. In the words of Michael Manley, you ask whose interests, I ask who set it up. It's not just that science is inherently political, it's that historically, at least, science has been better at doing politics than politics is. Scientists don't make nature speak, but they have incredibly sophisticated techniques for the investigation of the natural world, and that authority is powerful politics by other means. To define the epoch without considering the implications, without considering what it is you are articulating with, is to take power without responsibility and without accountability. We're invited to discuss where is the Anthropocene now, but I don't have an agenda to propose, only the same questions that I have to ask of myself and my discipline. How are you going to get informed about the politics inherent to your work and take responsibility for the direction of your work and its politics in future? How will you use that understanding to shape your methodologies and thinking in the way that historically neoliberal, capitalist, and colonial priorities have shaped the methodologies and thinking of your discipline? And above all, how are you going to ensure that the science you do is based in and informed by the experience and priorities of the global majority and not just the 1% who got us into this mess? That's it.
Super, thank you. Any points of clarification or?
There is a question in the comments in the chat.
I can't see any chat, I'm afraid.
I think it's assignments, so we'll come back to it.
It's okay. Mark, yes.
Just a point of clarification. So, do you see the study of the Anthropocene as opening up science to all the other relevant subjects and investigating colonization, neoliberalism? Should science then encompass all of that?
So when first got kind of invited to talk on this, my initial response was, I don't want to do this because I don't think I'd be very popular in my own discipline, what I was going to say. Because what I was going to say is I feel historians of science have been, and I believe to myself, it's been disingenuous about our involvement, because basically we saw a big funding pile and went, I'll quick, make my topic relevant to this funding pile. And I feel that, that kind of take responsibility was a little bit directed to myself. And that's where I have a little bit of a kind of concern about saying that it's relevant to everything. Clearly at some level it is relevant to everything. But I suppose I want that political awareness and engagement from, precisely that idea of scientists aren't doing politics, when in fact they are, really worries me. So I would rather more self-conscious politics, more self-aware politics, and that accountability. So if that means engaging with these other disciplines, but I'm not expecting, you can't expect someone who's really expert at analysing plutonium to suddenly be also an expert in various social sciences. So in a sense that I'm just asking for a bit more basic awareness. Sorry, that's a thought. I can see by your face. I've not done it.
No, I just thought that was me thinking. So that's
Yeah.
my thinking phase, but that wasn't.
I think I don't have. That's why I wanted to end the questions. But I don't feel like I'm in a position to offer answers here. But I would extend the same questions that I'm putting on myself, which is I can see that there's irresponsibility in some of the ways that I've approached things, and I would extend that requirement of responsibility to other scholars as well.
And the first thing I'll say is, do not feel bad about being entrepreneurial. Academics to get funding, whereas to get funding cases. Do not worry about that, because what happens is, like you, we just bend it to our will. Okay, yes, we take money, but then we do what we want to do. So please do not, never apologize about that. I also think that you may have an idealized view of many scientists, but a lot of scientists you engage at UCL, deeply critical, understand the science is political, and actually struggle like you did that. So I think that's sort of like, and I understand why you set up these sort of like polarization.
But okay, so but then that is sort of the question. Deeply political, struggled how to reconcile their science with their politics. But I feel there's almost been a lack of thinking a bit creatively about what it might be to incorporate your politics into your techniques, given those techniques are fundamentally political. That's why I was going through what, it's a sort of science studies 101 of how politics works in science. It'd be very familiar to most people in the journalism field.
Yeah.
So given that, why is it so hard to think about what you might do around that politics, to do something a bit different rather than trying to fit in with the models that have been the dominant models for 200 years? So I think there is a challenge there to be a bit more creative in techniques and approach as well.
I'd be very naughty and say you have to be thrown out the epoch out there, and we've gone for the event because that encompasses the messy complexity of human society and engages everybody. So I would cheat and use you to push my political agenda. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Anytime.
Well, I'm acknowledging that.
This is a really interesting thing that we can pick up in the wider discussion. Emmeline Costa, can I just ask whether your point is a point of clarification, or just rather than I want to try and keep the debate mostly for after everyone has spoken.
Thank you. I wish to just logistically request that speakers identify themselves. There are some 40 people online, and we're a little in the dark as to who's speaking. And at least the sound quality is now, I think, fine, but initially it was very garbled. So that's a request. But I also just would like to comment, and I don't know who the last speaker was, but I appreciated her delving into sort of the ethical aspects of this decision and bringing in a very sort of human dimension to the discussion, which essentially has been sort of stratigraphic and focused on a non-human aspect in terms of not being cognizant of the far-reaching impacts of any definition of the Anthropocene on the human journey. So if you would please identify yourselves fundamentally.
Sure. The person who was speaking could only stay for the first hour was Mark Maslin, who's a professor in the geography department here, and has written quite widely on the idea of.
Who was the second? If you could just, in general, identify all speakers going forward, and starting with the person who just spoke after Mark, please. Okay,
so sorry. So that was Jenny Bulstrode, who's a lecturer in science and technology in the Department for Science and Technology Studies at UCL. Mariam, do you want to make your intervention?
Okay. I deeply regret the first sentence of this talk. Now we've had this part, but because I'm not very quick on my feet, I'm going to read it out anyway. The decision of the International Union of Geological Sciences on the 20th of March reignited disciplinary competition over the concept of where the Anthropocene belongs. If the decision rankles, it's probably not because it matters whether it's an epoch or an event, although it does, but because it privileges geology, and especially geological timescales, as the rightful arbiter of the concept. For social sciences and humanities scholars, what matters principally about the Anthropocene is unequal power relations. Relations, importantly, which have been forged historically, and that, as such, should be understood politically. So significant is historical time, Clark and Gunaratnam argue, that researchers have been quick to police even their own colleagues for daring to engage with the Earth. In its very obduracy, they write, the Earth has generally signified inertia and stability, so foreclosing the possibility of collective social action. So in these few minutes, I just want to take up this question of geological versus, in inverted commas, historical time, and explore its implications for animals. Because in environmental and ecological debates, animals are mostly understood in terms of species located in evolutionary time. This is a problem because a species category does not act, it does not consent, nor does it even necessarily have to be populated by actual individuals. No biological theory needs the concept of species, writes the historian of biology, John Wilkins. Yet species remain stubbornly entrenched in both science and social science and humanities thinking. So what I'm going to try and do now is to suggest that in order to go forward with animals, we need to address not only the relations between species and geological time, but between species, race, and historical time. So in the 1950s, Japanese ethologists identified different dialects of birdsong in the same species. In the 1960s, Jane Goodall identified differences between individual chimpanzees and groups of chimpanzees. By the 1990s, it was finally acceptable for ecologists and ethologists to conduct, as the historian Eric Barate put it, sociological, ethnographic, geographical, and cultural studies of animals, which speak to perennial behavioral differences. The sameness of animals and animal behaviors, in other words, which is implied by the concept of species, appears to be unraveling. Nevertheless, Barate continues, differences between animals mostly remain indexed to spaces, concretized, he writes, as a diversity of environments, which are the locus of differentiation. This focus on space is an inheritance of the Greeks, especially Aristotle's Scala Naturae, further consolidated by Christianity. The Greeks conceived of differences between animals as variations within permanent and constant categories. Understood thus, variations have no consequences over time. This is characteristic of typological thinking. A type is forever. It's ahistorical and atemporal. It's for all time, and it's untouched by time. The same goes for typological conceptions of race. Even though the 19th century monogenists and polygenists understood the relations between human variations and racial categories differently, their common belief was that variation will never transform the category itself. Enter Darwin. Darwin argued that substantial variations exist within a species and that under the right conditions, these variations can convert into differences between species. The controversial issue here was not evolution, but natural selection. Is the Earth old enough to bear the consequences of what were at the time believed to be infinitesimally small encounters between random variation and non-random selection? Although the account of the Earth's origin given in the book of Genesis was weakening, little geological evidence existed to prove that the Earth was more than 4,000 years old. The answer to the question, is the Earth old enough, would for decades be no. Darwin's theory of natural selection invokes two types of time. Time as the linear medium of change, so variations transform species over time, and time as an element that introduces unpredictability into the encounter between individual variation and natural selection. And this is why Darwin's famous transmutation diagram represents evolution not as a gradual unfolding, but as a branching process. It wasn't enough, however, to transform conceptions of race. Because while Darwin de-essentialized race by proposing that, like species, it couldn't be defined by fixed features or abilities, he simultaneously re-essentialized it by situating race, again like species, in deep time, so rendering it, to all intents and purposes, a really existing thing. Origin stories, Sylvia Wynter writes, are cures for afflictions. The affliction of today, she says, is one concerned with who we are and the need for a we. The cure for this affliction is species. And she's right, of course. Post-population genetics is precisely the species boundary that enables proportions of human genetic similarity, we're greatly similar, and difference, we're not very different at all, to be identified. In this respect, the deep time of species undergirds the dissolution of race as a viable biological category, and with it the contraction of the time of race, meaning processes of racialization, to the comparatively short durée of specific cultures, histories, and societies. Racism may well be enduring, but race is neither atemporal, as it was for the typologists, nor lodged in deep evolutionary time, as it was for Darwin. Today, biology constitutes the evidence that race can have no origin other than politics, particular forms of which transmute relatively rapidly. So despite the ongoing racist exploitation of animality, which draws both on race and species, this story, as Wynter puts it, marks a real bifurcation in historiographies of the concepts of race and species. In short, these two concepts now belong to very different timescales. So back to animals. What scientists forget, Barate argues, is that the animals they see before them are not the same as the animals of the same species who've existed previously. If historical records suggest that dogs of the past, say, were different to those of today, scientists will assume that earlier observers were wrong, and they're right. In doing so, Barate continues, scientists deny that time is a real and productive factor in animals' lives, i.e. that animals are history makers. This is a hugely important analysis, and I welcome it. Yet, in confining the analysis to differences between animals within the same species, Barate implicitly defers to the distinction between apolitical geological time and political historical time. So what would it take to undo this? Far from being inert, the Earth today is better understood as complex and dynamic, with a propensity for nonlinear shifts at relatively high velocities between a range of possible states. Clark and Gunaratnam spell out the implications for the human species. Time and time again, they write, early humans would have had to have faced the rapid onset of a wildly vacillating climate. What's interesting for them is not the pan-human unity that triumphantly emerges, the becoming one species of humans, that's integral to the becoming political of race, but the fact that the oneness of the human species is a contingent and precarious achievement, indebted to multiple human species that have survived climate change and thrived differently. Prompted by their frustration with the social science prohibition on asking how geological processes alongside capitalism and colonialism might shape human collectives, they ask somewhat controversially how contemporary physiological variations, different ways of storing fat, different compositions of gut bacteria, even different skin colors, are, to quote, going to play out in a world whose average surface temperatures may be very much higher than at present. Or perhaps not so controversially, biological variation is not determining here. On the contrary, biology is a tribute to the successful cultural innovation and social organization of humans, successful enough to endure environmental forces long enough for them to impact upon a population's genetic makeup. If we were to apply this same argument to animals, then we'd have to recognize animals not solely as history makers over social and cultural generations, as Baratte does, but as the social and cultural makers of their biological histories too. And this is one way to politicize species. As well as the burden of Greek and Christian legacies, Baratte points to the profound methodological challenges posed by any kind of historical work on animals. To these burdens, I would add the histories of the concept of race, which offer yet more reason to be inclined to disavow deep time. Christopher Peterson advocates a return to 19th century conceptions of race, in which races of cabbages made as much sense as races of people. I would question, though, whether it's desirable to forget the racialization of race, as he puts it, and whether it's desirable to undo the important connections that have been established in contemporary theory between the category of race and the politics of racism. At the same time, we simply cannot leave animals moored in a timescale so static, it may as well be typological. For sure, we speak of animal agency in the present, but rarely do we speak of animal collectives as having the nous, basically, to organize themselves in ways that bear on their biological destinies. This is arguably the temporal politics of a violent anthropocentrism that keeps animals in their place in space. It's no accident that endangered species should, across the planet, appear on lists, or that the mother of all lists, the red list, should be described as a map of conservation. These lists achieve many things, but for me, the most significant of their achievements is the reification of the distinction, as Iris Braverman puts it, between those who save humans and those who can only ever be saved. Although it may seem counterintuitive, going forward in the context of the Anthropocene, I think we should consider releasing animals from the cages of these categories and lists and support their every effort to reinvent themselves differently, to transform themselves, as Clark and Gunaratnam write about humans, through their channeling of geologic potentiality, which clearly they're going to need to do. Or to put that otherwise, we need to stop seeing animals as solely the dead and dying species victims of anthropogenic change and start appreciating them as earth-long actors from whom we might learn and with whom we might act. That's it.
Super. Thank you. Are there any points of clarification? So
Very, very small, obvious, but in the world of rescue animals, people do think about that as a saving. People do, there is a language for saying my animals, but I mean, I'm not sure if this is a positive thing, but in that case, it's there. Yeah, there is in that kind of. I think it's really complicated in that domesticated sphere though. So I was thinking more in terms of this very kind of big global scale. But you're right, they do, and there's recently been a lot of interesting work on dogs, for example, being care workers and so on. So I do think you're right, that there are pockets where animals are seen to support humans. And so I think there's an emphasis on the emotional relationship, because you know, when we talk about the relationship in Europe, rather than rationality, where animals are being very nice emotions, rather than human expression.
I think we need in these kind of ecological environmental debates, it's kind of all kind of language of species, what I think of
you know, kind of where animals get protected or not, depending on whether they're on this. And, you know, the scene of Martin, I hear the whole kind of, you know, boil and debate about whether their minds being started the empathy and so on. And it encourages a particular kind of relationship to, or a particular kind of non-relationship language, as opposed to relationship to.
Okay, super. I think for the discussion, I might need to sort of translate some of the questions from the board to people online. I think that the audio isn't good enough to pick up. That's a lot. So, you know, when we do get into that, I will ask people in the room to speak loudly and clearly. Andrew, would you like to sort of close the sort of formal position?
Well, thank you so much. And after 3 such marvelous talks, I'm going to speak informally and perhaps reiterate, but also reflect on some of the things which have been said. We began with the Anthropocene controversy, the question of the AWG, the question of whether Anthropocene is epoch or event. I think, and perhaps this resonates with some of the things that Jenny has said, that if like the Anthropocene working group had to confront an extraordinary kind of and perhaps impossible challenge, which can be conceived of as a kind of interdisciplinary challenge. On the one hand, they were continually drawn to address the demands of the geoscientific community, who demanded a scientific analysis of the problem. On the other hand, the Anthropocene as a concept, as we've heard, pushes one towards a much wider tablet of disciplines and concerns, which would be unacceptable to a geoscientific analysis to include. And I think if one looks at the writings of the Anthropocene Working Group, really over the past 20 years, there's a kind of oscillation around this point, which in the end is unresolvable. I think there's a question of whether the Anthropocene as event, in its geological sense, resolves this debate, but it certainly displaces it onto a new terrain and possibly loosens it. That's another question for another moment. But in a sense, I think the Anthropocene Working Group are faced by this kind of challenge of, perhaps resonating with what Jenny has said, of trying to be scientific in the traditional sense, or doing something more radical, but then would never possibly going through the kind of institutional process. Let's just take the notion of the Anthropocene as event, and we can take it not just connoting the possibility of kind of multiple temporalities, of the entanglement of many histories, geo-histories, the histories of capitalism and colonialism and so forth, but also the Anthropocene debate as an event, as a question which is provoked, kind of questions within the social sciences and humanities and the geosciences as well. And in that sense, I think there's been many critiques of the notion of the Anthropocene in the social sciences, that it's kind of offers an explanation which seems to be to bypass more established and indeed more kind of well thought through explanations of events. The kind of the idea of the capitalist scene points to this. But perhaps we might say that the Anthropocene was never an explanation in the first place. It's really, as Whitehead would say, an abstraction which needs to be explained rather than offer an explanation. How did it come to pass, or that this extraordinary kind of wave of different transformations, which Simon has briefly described, happen? And what we see here, and this perhaps also resonates with what Jenny has said about measurement, and it is an extraordinary kind of, one might see the Anthropocene as a kind of extraordinary exercise in summing up of the collection of a whole series of movements which need to be not reducible to measurement. So the Anthropocene is a kind of a non-explanatory abstraction, which itself is a provocation for thinking something differently. Recognizing that actually the question of the social sciences needs to be expanded beyond a kind of a narrow conception with the human. Perhaps the result of all this is, one might say that the Anthropocene, yes, is not a kind of category of an explanation, but rather an event, and perhaps one of the consequences of that event should open up the question, which is long overdue, of the question of how to think or how to rethink the politics and ethics of the natural sciences in a way which, as Mark alluded to, and certainly is that I think is kind of happening in a way, in a very informal way. Perhaps the work of the Anthropocene Working Group is a manifestation of this, a growing kind of new recognition, rather different from the recognition in the mid-20th century, when a whole series of natural scientists became very concerned with political economy, of the role of science and socialism and so forth. A new set of concerns with the entanglement of the sciences with the planetary scale transformations which are being witnessed in diverse ways. So maybe the provocation here is to open up new ways of thinking, new concerns with the politics and ethics of sciences across a range of sciences, including the sciences of animals, of life, as much as anything else, as we've heard from Mariam. So I will leave it there with those reflections, and thanks to everyone for their contributions too. Thanks.
Super, thank you, and thank you to we've got just about 45 minutes for questions. And there are lots of different directions we could take this in. Maybe I will start things off by just commenting on, and then perhaps inviting further comments from the panel, and then inviting comments from audience members on this question of the politics of the Anthropocene, which has come up quite a lot. Jenny, I think you said, that science is political all the way down, and that that scientists are better at doing politics than politicians are. Used to be. Okay.
Might not be anymore.
All right.
I don't know.
So it seems, so people have responded to the rejection of the Anthropocene as epoch as a political, or responded to its political implications in very, very different ways. So in the room, there's been some people broadly welcoming that. Elsewhere, there's been, and I've heard it from other colleagues, on the fringes of or inside the Anthropocene Working Group, there's been a sort of despair at the loss of the clarity of what was being proposed as a political concept. It was being propounded as a scientific concept, but it had political effects and was also therefore operationally politically. So it seems to me that it's not entirely. People have sort of talked about the politics of the Anthropocene, but there isn't a single politics of the Anthropocene, even as proposed by the AWG. It seems to me, the effects of what's been decided could, one could argue that there are beneficial effects. One could also argue there are negative effects from a very particular contemporary instrumental point of view in terms of the clarity of that concept as a mobilizing device. So I don't know whether anyone would like to comment on this question of the politics of the Anthropocene. if that is what science does, then is the question then, well, has the politics of this Anthropocene, as proposed by the AWG, been a good politics? Or is the problem that it can't be read politically, or it can't be evaluated politically because it's not articulated in political terms, it's articulated in scientific terms? I don't know if anyone would want to kind of comment on that, or others. Ben.
Do I need to come up with a-
If you're happy to, I think that would probably help.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on the final formulation you were using there and what you were saying, because you used the term articulated, which is kind of a key term that I was speaking with. And what I wanted to get across with that term is not simply how are you expressing this, but the point about using Stuart Hall's idea of articulation is that this is also making a connection with other dominant concepts. So when I'm talking about what politics do we need right now, it's to think critically about what are the dominant dominant political structures that the techniques you are using are connecting with, and how are they then potentially going to be used, and what are they furthering with? So that idea of physical connection is sort of important there for me in that. And I completely agree that there can't be and shouldn't be a singular politics. That would be quite concerning. But it's that kind of critical thought about what is the articulation in the sense of connection, as well as in the sense of expression, that's happening here in the way that we're analyzing this. And then to go back kind of, because I think it speaks to this, to the exchange that I was having with, I think it was Mark Maslin, but slightly off the audio. And he asked whether, I think he was asking whether I felt that scientists should be taking on the strategies of politicians or political strategies into their methods. I might have got that wrong. And I started kind of burbling around funding. And the reason I was doing that is because in some ways what Simon's been tasked with doing here with this Anthropocene term kind of reminds me of the way we as academics are tasked with producing impact case studies. And we're supposed to produce a baseline, and we're supposed to measure the change, and then we're going to show how big it was, and that's going to get us funding. And how different that task is to actually what the issue at question is with what we're studying, with what we're supposedly putting through the impact case study, and the way in which what the question is and the project that we're trying to present gets completely distorted by the purposes of the impact case study. I realize this doesn't mean so much for people who don't go through the impact case study process, but I'm hoping the analogy sort of makes sense in that we're talking about many different politics, but also politics in around many different sort of sections. And I'm not particularly, I think it's terrible what Anthropocene working group people are put through and are made to put through one another through in the process of the politics of their internal organization. But it's a separate question to the politics of what we need to be doing now with the Anthropocene and research, or so it seems to me. Yeah.
Would any of the rest of you like to pick up on any of this? Mariam. And then I'll take Matt and then Florian.
I would like to pick up just for a second, but I'm also a bit wary about changing the register of the discussion. Andrew, you said politics and ethics of a time to revisit the politics and ethics of the natural sciences. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Nigel Clarke and Yasmin Gunaratnam's work is that it's about what they call it, the way that they describe it is geologizing the social. So I mean, I probably didn't make clear enough in the paper, but they're really concerned with the ways in which we're very comfortable with the idea of scientists having to, in some ways, adopt, whether it's in the sense of self-awareness, self-reflexivity, or understanding social inequalities or whatever better. We're very comfortable with that idea, whereas we're less comfortable as social scientists and humanities scholars with thinking about less confident about thinking about how I mean, I think one of the reasons I was going to say we're less confident about thinking about, for example, how some of the kind of geological timescales and our understandings of geological change might change social science concepts. And of course, one of the reasons that one of the barriers to doing that is because we have always already politicized those descriptions. So that seems to me, feels like a bit of an impasse in some ways. And so in terms of rethinking an event, this is an event, I think we really, really need to get past that impasse. And it's not entirely dissimilar to some of the kind of cul-de-sacs that we found ourselves in relation to animals, and which is why I think it's so important to politicize species.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just add something that, I mean, in some sense, the kind of the challenge which social sciences have parallels the challenge the Anthropocene Working Group has, is that the one danger is we retreat into a comfortable kind of social universe. The other is we, despite your warning, we treat the scientists too seriously, that some of the kind of moves within the kind of move to the non-human treat the sciences uncritically and just absorb scientific lessons in a kind of straightforward way. So that's a really, we're kind of challenged in both directions in that way, just like the natural sciences are.
Although and interestingly, that requires that social scientists develop a mode of articulating their authority in order for it to be counterpointed to that scientific authority in a way that is legible to non-specialists, which is not something they've always necessarily done or thought that they needed to do, insofar as critiquing those forms of authority is part of what they're often we are often keen to do. Matt, do you want to comment on or sort of articulate your question there in the chat?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Very, very loudly.
Oh, okay, sorry. I won't read out the comment I've already put there, but perhaps I could just point out that the Anthropocene is very much an evolving concept. One of the problems has been that it's been adhered, an original definition made over 20 years ago has actually been adhered to very rigidly, and that the Anthropocene is an idea that needs to be worked through. And in an important sense, the idea of the Anthropocene event is an evolution of that original concept. And I don't think Crutzen himself would want us to adhere too rigidly to some definition he made back then. I think he would be the first person to accept that this is an idea that has to be tested out, it has to be examined quite closely and thought through, and lots of avenues explored. And I wondered what the panel thought of that idea of the Anthropocene as an idea that can change, will change, and it's necessary for it to change. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone like to comment on that? Simon, do you want to? Yeah.
I think what's interesting, what Matt's brought up is that exactly, I think, you know, these concepts do change, and the Anthropocene, even though it's been, you know, bandied about for 20 odd years as that term, and people have been thinking about human activity and geology for a lot longer. A lot of geological concepts, so things like concepts of the Holocene, Pleistocene, you know, these big time units have been, you know, were pretty much invented pretty quickly when geology as a science was developed. These sort of, you know, big structural units of chronological time were put together. And the Holocene itself is probably 200 years old as a concept. It was very quickly developed as like, we should call this period of time recent. And it just encompasses everything from, you know, creation to the present, and then it got, you know, to like conceptualized in down to much more detail. So the Anthropocene as a concept has only existed for a very short amount of time. So it clearly will develop and change over time. But one thing that won't change over time is the evidence right now in the geological form that exists. That is not going anywhere. So as our concepts change and thinking about the Anthropocene, the evidence for this change will be picked over and looked at again in the future. So we can think of geologists in 300 years' time and how they will think of, actual look at the physical remains of underground. So that stuff's not going away. So this stuff will develop. And I think that's a good point, Matt, but, I was thinking on the train coming down here, thinking about that graph, like thinking in like 300 years time, but potentially we're thinking about Miocene conditions, let alone, so we'd geologists in 300 years time would, rather than saying, well, maybe we should call this the Anthropocene, maybe we should start rethinking the Quaternary, because if we lose the ice caps as a result of the change we've instigated, then the Quaternary becomes a thing that we should reconsider. And that is within a historical time frame. That's an astonishing geological change, but we might need to be thinking about 300 years time. So this stuff will continue and will develop.
Yeah. And there's a sort of part of the discomfort is in the contrast between the use, seems to me, is in the use politically that in terms of climate crisis, that's one wants to put the Anthropocene to use to, which is a very pinched time frame, with the sort of broader, more expansive, more relaxed way in which one might think about that. So it seems to me there's also a sort of tension here, which partly partly goes back to that earlier conversation, Mark's comments in relation to your comments, Simon. Florian, and then Emlyn.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Sorry, my voice is slightly dodgy because I'm recovering from a cold. Sorry. I just wanted to respond to, or sort of reflect a bit further on that point about the period versus event, and whether that distinction resonates across disciplines. And I think I found very interesting what Mariam said about the work around period and the debate about period being very thoroughly understood also in the social sciences and in the humanities, and also it being thoroughly understood how it is politicized and how it can be differently politicized. And I was just curious to get a sense of whether people in the humanities and the social sciences feel that event is potentially an opening for different forms of politicization. I'm not sure whether Mark is still in the room, but I read Mark's, he's gone, okay. But I read Mark's, some of the sort of the shorter pieces that Mark's co-authored, where one of the points which is being made is that there is an opening potentially to different forms of dialogue with the humanities and the social sciences, where event is very much theorized. But it strikes me, at least from what I can understand, that event in the context of the Anthropocene, so a geological event, is actually not yet very sort of fully discussed. So I hear that an event, in a sense, both condenses the time frame and sort of potentially, we heard earlier, amplifies the time frame that we've been looking at so far. And I think from the humanities perspective, thinking of the Anthropocene as a cultural dominant, that's a massive difference, and what kinds of sort of plotting we're thinking about when we think of an event. So I'm just curious, I mean, I see the potential of the event as an opening to different forms of politicization and different forms of transdisciplinary debates, but I don't have a sort of good grasp at this point of sort of where the debate around the Anthropocene as event would actually initiate across disciplines. Thank you.
That's really helpful, Florian. Thank you. Comments, responses? I mean, that seems, Andrew, to me to speak to your point about the Anthropocene not not being, you know, it's an abstraction, not an explanation. All of the explanatory work remains to be done to it. I mean, I don't know whether you think that event epoch contrast is useful in that respect, or I mean, I think you said actually it just displaces the conversation somewhere else.
Well,
Someone might say something more about the
I was thinking about like the event concept, like opening up new avenues. It's just, I sort of think, well, we just spent 10 years pretty much talking about the epoch, you know, as the epoch concept, opening up transdisciplinary conversations. And it was just I was just going to say that these conversations and transdisciplinary things work, you know, both on the event and the epoch. You know, these are all conversations to have. And I think the one thing about the Anthropocene as a word, as a term, is exactly these conversations. The Anthropocene working group had an astonishing relationship with a huge variety of scholars having transdisciplinary conversations. And that was very primarily, you know, focused on like the epoch concept and looking at this very dramatic recent change in the mid-20th century onwards. But those conversations was transdisciplinary as a conversation, I guess, if you were talking about the event as well. So I think the Anthropocene is a great talking shop to look at both of these ways.
But did any of that, could any of that have framed or shaped what the actual technical scientific activities were that were playing out? I mean, you know, all of the stuff that's, you know, that was done with the Max Planck and the HKW was extraordinary, but it was a sort of, and the one, could one not say that it was a sort of penumbra around the core activity rather than actually altering what any of that core activity was?
Well, that is the hardest thing. I mean, isn't it? Because I mean, there's a discussion to be had across disciplines, but at what point do we start influencing disciplines? And so that sort of, someone said geologizing the social, or was it the other way around? It was Nigel Clark, I think, who said that. You know, and so, but when you think, well, what happens if we start I can't even say it, socializing with geological, or was it geological? So, you know, but so if we start having conversations, and I think it's one of those, if they're really interesting conversations to have, these, I mean, you know, it's because scientists sometimes don't have the language to talk in this sort of this work to sort of have these conversations, but then perpetuate into an actual change within the disciplines. You know, I'm running out of words myself here because, you know, it's very hard to have these conversations to actually change effect. Like, you know, like I was saying earlier, like historians of science, when you start a scientific degree, it's very rare to start thinking about why we're doing this, because there's so much science to get your head around. There we go. That's my.
Jenny, Andrew, did you want to comment on this?
Well, I suppose I would just say that, that in a way, the Anthropocene working group made the kind of the politicization of the geosciences very easy. I mean, after all, taking the plutonium as a marker for the Anthropocene, what could be more transparent kind of way in which geology is transformed by geopolitics? It isn't complex.
But it wasn't a political decision.
No. Yeah, I mean, no, but nonetheless, the kind of question one is creating a clearly hybrid object. There's a clear sense that in the mid-20th century, there's a kind of movement which is registered by the Anthropocene working group from a kind of a belief that the distribution of minerals and elements and atmospheres on the Earth is basically the product of a natural evolutionary process. We can see this in the work of the geochemists of the mid-20th century. And then another event which happens in 1962, Rachel Carson's publication Silent Spring, in which she says, no, actually pollution is pervasive. And it's like the nuclear radiation. Everything is unnatural. So it's a kind of both the transformation, which is registered after the attack, because obviously the changes have been going on for a very long time, but actually a recognition that this is at this moment, that the fact that nuclear testing can create this kind of planetary wide transformation in virtually everything, even if it's at a very, very low level of concentration.
Jenny, Mariam, did you want to come in on this?
Would I need to come up, or can you?
I can check if it's audible and relay if necessary.
For sad and unrelated reasons, I've been rereading 1984 and particularly the appendix on language, partly because my discipline, science technology studies, sociology of science technology, sits in a very uncomfortable relationship with that particular book, actually, in funny ways. But one of the things that the appendix of language discusses is around how terms being defined very precisely by Big Brother, and the purpose of the precision of language to define possible interpretations, but also to prevent the possibility of even thinking of possible other interpretations. So it doesn't just define what you're going to take from it, but stops the possibility of other thoughts. And obviously it's a famous dystopia. And I'm not saying that scientific practice is totally dystopian, but it was making me think about how terms work in my own discipline, in all of our disciplines, in fact. And when we talk about how are these very sophisticated techniques for analyzing samples supposed to be somehow incorporated with something slightly messy and chaotic coming from social sciences and humanities, realistically, what would that ever be? But terminology might be quite an interesting place to start, and experimenting around those ideas before we get down to actually the construction of instruments themselves and the techniques of apparatus, that hopefully, that might be where that would go. But I agree with you. It's a, how would that even happen?
Yeah.
But I think the fact that we're even asking that question is quite important. I'm not sure that question was the one being asked before now until this.
So just to very quickly gloss for online. So this is a comment apropos of the Orwell's 1984 and its appendix on language, and Jenny's sort of commenting on the on thinking about what particular terms articulate, go back to that word, and before one gets very far down a conversation about kind of categorizing or defining phenomena like Anthropocene or whatever it might be, one thinks about what some of the underlying organizing terms are that might be doing some of that work.
It's the idea that defining terms doesn't just define a set of interpretations to take from it.
No.
It actually cuts off the possibility. Yeah. It prevents the possibility of thinking of alternatives. Yeah. And those are two different things, and they're quite significant, because actually science is supposed to be creative and experimental. Otherwise, it's training, right? Otherwise, it's learning what's been done. It should be open-ended. But actually, once you get down to defining a term, you've closed off possibilities.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that applies to everything. I don't think this is just scientists. I think it's true when we talk about English literature, classics, or whatever. It would be true for linguists translating as well. The idea of what possible meanings.
Sure. Yeah. So a comment about what terms preclude as well as enable, which is, I think, a point you made right at the start of your presentation as well. Yeah. Emlyn, you've waited very patiently.
Thank you. I'm going to make a comment on two of the remarks in the last 5 minutes and maybe 15 minutes ago. One about how much the AWG's thinking was conditioned by the original statements by Paul Crutzen in his Geology of Mankind paper. And here I'm just quoting what was in a paper that Phil Gibbard and Mark Maslin and I put into the current issue of the Journal of Geoethics and Social Geosciences last week. If you look back at the interview of Paul Crutzen in the sort of coffee table book, Welcome to the Anthropocene, on the exhibition at the Deutsche Museum in 2015, and I quote, this is about him, asked whether the Anthropocene idea was purely a scientific hypothesis, or was it more? Paul Crutzen projected that the Anthropocene, quote, develops into a metaphor about the relationship between nature and humankind, end quote, and assessed that, quote, it is not a single entity, but a huge variety of possibilities that cannot be ranked. And lastly, elsewhere in that quote, the Anthropocene idea, he said, is now animating many people in many places in many new ways. My second point, which I'd invite any comment on, which is also made in our paper last week in the Journal of Geoethics, is that my understanding, and as we document, really the first mention in the scientific literature or the geopolitical literature even of the notion or the expectation that the Anthropocene would be defined by a plutonium-defined mid-20th century epoch was not, strangely, in geological literature. It was in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was the journal started by Einstein right after the 1945 horrendous event that led to the 2 bomb drops in Japan. And it seems, as we document by looking at the literature, and I invite comments on this point in particular, is that it seems like that expectation was made that the Anthropocene would be defined by an epoch in some mid-latitude lake or estuary, and that in 2019, when the AWG made strongly supported motions that it would be a mid-20th century event, and it would be based indeed on the abundance of atomic bomb fallout, then it seems like it was an exercise in search of evidence to support an already made conclusion. And I think that's something which I think has to be answered to, because that sequence of events, that it was identified or anticipated in a non-geological journal, particularly in the Journal of the Atomic Scientists, which still goes on today, that it was defined or anticipated to be a mid-20th century epoch based on a rather unemotive consideration of atomic bomb waste dropped in a variety of environments in 2019, and then the search of evidence coming up with 12 sites culminating in Crawford Lake that actually just ratified what had already been anticipated. That's not the way, as we document in this paper last week, that most intervals in the geological timescale have come about. They have been the result of cumulative incremental evidence, not the affirmation of a already anticipated conclusion.
Does anyone want to comment on that? Simon, did you want to come in on that? Andrew?
Perhaps I can just reassociate. I don't have a kind of answer to that question, but reassociate to this period, late 50s, early 60s, my association to your comment on Stuart Hall's articulation. For Stuart Hall, you could see that the notion of articulation and conjuncture is for him a response to the 1956 and kind of a need to rethink Marxism in the weight of the colonial event of the Suez Crisis, and of course the Budapest, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. So in a sense, what one might think here is the kind of you need to kind of expand that conjuncture to recognise the centrality of the whole series of paintings which are described in the notion of the Anthropocene.
Questions in the room? Yes, please.
Yeah, and then on to the back. Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask a question that's kind of half speaking to the point about politics. So
could you bear to
sure,
come up?
Yeah.
It's otherwise I'll just have to repeat it for everyone online. Sorry.
So yeah, I guess with previous geological eras, I was just wondering how long is the transition conceptualized as being between the two? Because you've kind of isolated the 1950s, but is it a decade, 100 years, a millennia that's marks the kind of transition at the beginning of the Holocene, for instance? Because if it is a much longer time span, then can it only be recognized by geologists in retrospect, whereas we are in a kind of transitional moment, making it much harder for an epoch changing event to be recognized after 70 years, for instance. And I suppose I was thinking about that because in some ways, I think the Anthropocene has shifted us away from the kind of debate that dominated my childhood, so a kind of prospective question about global warming, into a much more retrospective mode of thinking like what has happened historically, making visible the scale of environmental change that's already happened. And then maybe this can draw us around to a kind of question about drawing on kind of Jenny's paper, the geological community hasn't verified the terminology of the Anthropocene. So where are we left then politically? What work did an epoch do that an event doesn't? It just seems that Anthropocene has become such a kind of powerful political language. So, you know, if we're left with an event, what do you anticipate the impact of that might be on political discourse? Does it make the changes happening less visible? Does it push us back into the realm of the perspective? Yeah.
Super, thank you. You might like to.
I'm just trying to look. So, I mean, the run up. Let's start with the run up time. The how long these sort of boundaries are. So the Holocene is defined at 11,700 B2K before 2000. I think it's 11,000. But that is on a point. So it's definitely a point in an ice core which says below that is the Pleistocene, above that is the Holocene. That's definitely a point, and it points to a layer of ice which has got an error margin of quite a bit. It's not. I'm trying to think what the error margin is. There's an error margin. So it's a definite point in a position in an ice core, and it describes a absolutely specific year, plus or minus, before the year 2000. But we know the Holocene, as you said. So clearly, I think you've done your homework. But the Holocene itself didn't just like flip from the Pleistocene. You know, it wasn't like Ice Age, the movie. It didn't suddenly just go, we're in Ice Age and now we're in the Holocene. The Holocene itself took a long time. The effects of the Holocene took a long time to turn around. So in that sense, the concept of the golden spike is a very specific point in time, and that is used for the chronostratigraphic framework. And chronostratigraphy is how, with the best dating techniques you have for geologists, is it enables you to define, you know, specifically the time. But there is an understanding that those points in time do always represent changes over time. And that's sometimes confused with the golden spike, this idea of like the Anthropocene starting in 1952, because you know it did and it didn't. You know, what we're recognizing there is a very specific point in a stratigraphic section which represents that time. If you look, and it's 1952, but it's absolutely 1952 because it's a varved record. We can count back, and so we know that is, I think it's like autumn 1952. It's a very specific point in time, but we know that boundary, the change in the Anthropocene, did also occur over a period of time. In this case, over a period of decades, and also what created the Anthropocene over a period of thousands of years. But that very big change, the great acceleration recognized, did occur over a space of decades, from the 1940s to 50s, 60s. And it was, you know, and we are living in a world that is created very much by that compared to the Holocene conditions. So those are some interesting differences there. I'm just trying to think. The other point you made was
about kind of retrospective versus like prospective ways of understanding scale of environmental challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. It would be ideal to have a time machine and go into the future and look back and say, is it enough to the changes we've seen over the last 70 years? Was that enough to actually say, yeah, definitely they're on the right lines? That was definitely an epoch scale occurring. And our work was always looking back. It's interesting, as stratigraphers, we were warned not to look forwards. You know, stratigraphy doesn't tell us about the future, modeling does. And we were very keen to sort of like elaborate on the Anthropocene epoch concept, because we have models that can tell us what it will be like in 1,000 years, 300 years, 1,000 years time, or, you know, certainly, you know, lifetimes away in the future. So it does enable you to sort of like think about the future. But for most of geological boundaries, we always have a wonderful thing of being able to see the whole picture. We're just in a situation where we are, but we've able to be identified an epoch level change. It just happens, we think, to have occurred in the last 70 years, which is the same age as, you know, some of my colleagues. So that's something. Yeah, I know. I didn't say which colleagues, but some. But you know, that is not here. No, not here, guys. No. But that's interesting. I mean, so that time frame is quite an interesting thing, because geologists are always quite good at looking at different time frames and sort of things like that. But this is a time frame for such a big change to have occurred so recently. It's a difficult challenge to sort of conceive.
And then a bit about the politics of event versus epoch, like what political work you hope and you think that epoch was doing versus.
So I think I mean politically.
Are you allowed to comment?
Well, I mean, I'll comment myself. I always see that the event aspect politically would suggest. I think it suggests that it's taken a long time to get to this point. It's clearly ongoing. So whatever we've been doing for a period of long time is kind of the same thing. I mean, there's been various changes and accelerated, but without a definite point. I mean, are we just saying this is like a continuation of the Holocene? But what we're saying by an epoch is it is fundamentally different from the Holocene. And that has a significant political thing, because you're saying that whatever has occurred up to now has been kind of the same thing, or the Holocene, but we're saying that we've shifted the planet so greatly that we've nudged it into a new epoch, which, you know, I think that sends out a much stronger message about what as a planet we're capable of, as a species living on this planet, what we're capable of doing, and also what we're capable of changing. We're capable of changing a planet, which is an astonishing thing. I'm not saying well done us, but it's an astonishing thing to think that we've changed it in such a short amount of time, which must also give us hope that we can change it wherever we want to decide it in a similar time frame. But we're stuck right now with a legacy of what we've done in terms of combustion of fossil fuels, which will take a long time. Whatever we do now will take a long time to come back to. Yeah, sorry, I could.
In a second, I'm gonna ask unfairly the panel for their sort of one couple of sentence answer to the question we posed in the title of this seminar: where is the Anthropocene now? So my apologies to them for crudely asking them to reflect on that just very succinctly. But we've got I'll take one more, just this final question from Professor Gibbard, and then I'll ask them to comment on that. So if you could just frame it relatively concisely, that would be super.
Well, there's a number of points actually which I could raise, and first of all, I'd like to point out that I lived through the boundary which Simon has favoured. In fact, I was already 3 years old when it happened, so and I didn't notice it, incidentally. But maybe that's just me. But the point really which is important here is to understand the nature of the geological nomenclature. Now, as geologists, we're not in the business of telling our related disciplines what to do. But when we set up the Anthropocene Working Group, and incidentally, I did that, the original idea and brief for the Anthropocene Working Group was to decide whether there was any geological value in considering this term. We never actually had a decision on that. The Anthropocene Working Group went on and did their work, and they've done some extremely good work, I must say, and that's only fair. But I've got the sense at this meeting that the Anthropocene Working Group's attitude towards the SQS, which voted against the inclusion of the term Anthropocene within the geological timescale, has painted the SQS as rather an unfortunate body who are not fully informed or do not really appreciate the significance of events which are going on at the present, and they certainly are important, and no geologist, I think, would turn around and say otherwise. I've never understood quite, and perhaps Simon can make this clear to me, but I've never understood why the Anthropocene Working Group favoured the view that the division of time to be labelled Anthropocene or an equivalent thereof would not be, must be rather, an epoch. What does Simon, or what is the general view of an epoch? As many of you will know, the geological timescale is divided in a hierarchical fashion, and epoch is a very large division of time, usually of the order of 20 million years or so, although of course the Pliocene was considerably shorter, only 5 million, or 2.5 million rather, I apologize, and the Quaternary is of similar length. And I don't understand why one would choose to define an epoch which, when we have only lived through the last 70 years or 7 decades, if you prefer, of the current time. Why is this? Why is it necessary to raise this thing to the level of an epoch, when quite clearly, as many of you have said already, that the impact of humans on the natural systems has been going possibly for as much as 50,000 years. Of course, I'm aware of the acceleration concept, and I accept that there is something going on which is significant, but I don't see why it is any different from what was happening in the 1940s, the 1870s, or wherever you wish to choose it. But anyway, I won't go on any longer because I can see your time is running out. And I think there are a number of points here which have been rather glossed over, apart from painting the International Commission on Stratigraphy in rather a poor light. And I apologise if you find that criticism unvalid, but I do take it not very well. But thank you for your attention.
No, thank you. I mean, the whole point of the exercise was to have a kind of a free and open conversation. Simon, did you want to respond at all very briefly to any of that? Maybe you can close by commenting on where you think the Anthropocene is now.
Yeah, sure. So I think just in terms of like for scale, I mean, like in terms of like the scale of geological units and like why the epoch position went for is because when you compare it to like the changes that we've seen the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and you look at the small changes, the relatively small changes throughout the Holocene, and then you see this massive uptake and this big uptick. And again, it is problematic, but it is having only occurred in the last 70 years. So we don't have that long-term geological perspective to look back on it and see how it turned out over the long run. But in terms of like framing it, I mean, like for me, it's the scale of a change which seems enough to justify proposing it as an epoch. It's clearly different to the Holocene. And it's on that right sort of scale of change in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of change in atmospheric composition. I mean, we don't know how in the long run how it will end up, but I think the scale of that change, and it's very hard. There isn't a book you can go to which says how big is an epoch. You have to compare it to previous geological changes and previous epochs. And I think roughly, an epoch is about the right scale. Can I answer where is the Anthropocene? So I've been asked this before. People say, and I was on a train once and someone said, where is the Anthropocene? Where? And I was on the train and I was going, where is it now? I was saying, where is the Anthropocene? And I'm looking out the window and we were going through Leicestershire. And if where you go up on the train there, the whole landscape has been overturned by gravel extraction. And I was just literally talking to a French film company. I said, look, it's here. It's everywhere you look. you don't have to go digging anywhere to find the Anthropocene. It's right there. It's the plastic table we're sitting on. It's that overturned landscape out there. It's hard to see the composition of the atmosphere, but it is pretty much wherever you want to look right now in the modern world. It is right here. So you don't have to go very far for a field trip to see the Anthropocene. So that's visually, but conceptually, it's an ongoing process. I think there will be future discussions about the scale of the change we've identified. The Anthropocene working group is still intact. We've had a couple of retirements. Most of them are retired or sort of like, but they're all, this is such an interesting subject at the interface of humanities and sciences that it would be ridiculous to call it a day and not consider it Anthropocene anymore.
Super, thank you. Maybe I go Mariam, Jenny, and Andrew. That'd be super.
One thing that I've been really struck by through this discussion is how astonishingly similar the discussion of the temporal scales and of geological eras are to the ongoing and also hugely hotly contested discussions of species. And there are, of course, reasons for that because of their historical similarity, the similarities in their development in history, some of which I've talked about myself today. Probably what's different is that, as I said today, species isn't politicized in the same kind of way. And what I've also tried to indicate is that there are reasons for that, and we might be more reflexive about some of those reasons. Where is the Anthropocene now? For me, the answer is in the name. It remains anthropocentric, profoundly anthropocentric, not just in the sense of human-made changes, but in our entire ways of thinking about the planet. It remains really profoundly anthropocentric. So that for me is the biggest concern about the Anthropocene, that it isn't undoing any of these relations, but it's actually serving in many cases to sediment them, just to use a geological term to finish on.
Super, thank you. Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't think that there is a marker or a spike or a time frame that's somehow going to, if you just pick the right one, that's going to fix the political situation or that will have the right politics or whatever. I think this is more a question about scientists who have these incredibly sophisticated techniques, recognizing the power inherent to those techniques and the work that they're doing, rather than kind of, oh no, I'm just helpless. I'm really good at analyzing this particular kind of sample. It's sort of recognizing what's in that and then actually thinking creatively about how they can articulate, in the sense of making connections with other disciplines and with particular political constructs that they value and believe in, rather than ones that have maybe been part of the process of causing the problem in the first place. Yeah, so I think that was my essential take home, and that these comments about politics and these artworks and these interdisciplinary engagements shouldn't be just a backdrop to what's going on. They should be trying to do something different in what comes next. Though I think it's completely understandable that they are at the moment being held to very high standards of rigor within their own disciplines to produce something that fits within that expectation. My concern is that might be the issue. Yeah.
Super. Brilliant. Thank you. Andrew.
Yes. Well, my first reflection is that I'm very glad, though there are good reasons for it, that social scientists do not have to formally adopt terms and concepts and get them ratified internationally. Probably that's a more democratic situation and one which we should value rather than lament. Where is the Anthropocene? I guess where is the Anthropocene debate now? Is the Anthropocene a kind of rather faddish concept like postmodernism, which kind of briefly flourished and then disappeared in a cloud of smoke? Or does it have a kind of potential longevity, like the concept of capitalism, for example, which still has significance and resonance for good reasons? Well, in a way, as we've heard, the Anthropocene is kind of too human-centered, but not social enough in another respect. It's generative at this moment, and we have to perhaps accept that actually it is a kind of, it's a been and continues to be in both the geosciences and social sciences and history, generative of a debate which should not involve some resolution, let alone any kind of international agreement. So that's not a bad thing.
Super, thank you. So we've strayed 10 minutes over, but thank you for your indulgence in that. Thank you to everyone online. Thank you to everyone here. I mean, I think that's all. So it's very clear from that. You know, the work one is asking a concept to do is both problematic work, and that asking a concept to do that sort of work is in and of itself problematic. I mean, I think I absolutely agree with what Andrew says. This remains a useful framing within which to articulate something, to go back to Jenny's term, with all of the problems and benefits, for everything that precludes and enables in different ways. So UCL Anthropocene will certainly, I think, be continuing to do that into the next academic year, although there are, even only just tomorrow, more events that we're involved in. So do, if you're particularly interested in the animal side of things, you're very welcome to the talk and discussion of Eric Barate's work, who Mariam mentioned in her talk tomorrow afternoon online. You can find that if you just Google UCL Anthropocene, you'll find links through to that. But finally, I'd just like to really thank all of our speakers for their enormous generosity in thinking as expansively and as self-critically as they have about these very complicated and challenging topics, which perennially take us out of our comfort zone. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone online. Thank you. Those of you here in person, you're very welcome to stay on for a drink here. We will be bringing that up very shortly.